Ladies and gentlemen, it is 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We will jump into our webinar today talking about watching Washington. And with my colleague Buff Parham down there in South Carolina. We were just
How are you, David?
Yeah, I'm good. We were just chit-chatting about the weekend, and Buff mentioned that there was a storm down his way, but up where I am, it was a perfect day for the resuming of the New York Marathon. And I've done 8 New York marathons in my time, and I don't have any knees anymore as a result, but it sure was pretty to watch. So Buff, why don't you outline the agenda for today, and then we'll jump right in.
Well, obviously we have a lot to cover, and we're going to give David the show to begin with to really kind of delve into what we've all been talking about for the last, 6 months, Build Back Better. But by all means, if you have any questions, put them on the queue, and we will conclude with a few from me, as well as hopefully some from the audience as well. But given the time constraints, David, why don't you dive right in and give our listeners, our viewers, your sense of what the hell has been going on in DC.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I'll put your video on mute, and I'll bring you back in at the end.
Sounds good.
And here we go. So yes, David Edwards, President Herring Wealth in New York City, back in my physical office for the first time in 19 months. It's a different office than we used to have. We've got 3 medium-sized offices instead of 1 large office in case COVID breaks out here, but luckily we're all vaccinated. Today I'm going to be talking about a lot of material, and this is the first webinar I've done since April. For about 6 months, there was not much to do but watch and listen as the folks in Washington hammered out some very important infrastructure bills. So on Friday night at 11:30 p.m., the U.S. Congress voted in the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act of 2021. This is a bill that received bipartisan Republican and Democratic support as early as August, but it took until November 5th, for that bill to be completed. And the reason why has to do with politics. The first bill that we're talking about tonight is what I call a hard infrastructure bill, and that is a $1.2 billion for traditional infrastructure. So there's $110 billion for roads and bridges, $39 billion for mass transit and railroads, $65 billion to upgrade internet access for the whole country. Even in the 1940s, many parts of America did not have electricity. And thanks to the Rural Electrical Act of, I think, 1939 or so, every American had access to electricity. Well, now here we are 70 years later, every American needs access to the internet. And then also sending money to our ports. We all know that the ports are clogged right now, $17 billion to improve ports. We know that airports are terrible right now. A couple of years ago, I flew out of LaGuardia, a third world airport, into Mexico, into a first world airport. So we're spending $25 billion on airports. And then rebuilding the electrical grid. It's not enough to put windmills and turbines and dams across the country to generate clean energy. You need a system for transferring that electricity around. So we've got $65 billion for electricity. And then lastly, $55 billion to upgrade water facilities. We know that a lot of communities in this country drink lead-tainted water, and that's poisonous, and hopefully clean that up as well. So it was pretty easy for both Republicans and Democrats to agree to spend $1.2 trillion, sounds like a lot, it's not, to address these 20 years of deferred maintenance in the United States. There's a second bill. I call it the soft infrastructure bill, and it is it's officially known as the Build Back Better Act. And that bill does not have bipartisan support. It only has Democratic support. And the reason why is because soft infrastructure is not traditional infrastructure. But if you're a small business person these days, a small businessman or businesswoman, the number one complaint you have is about getting qualified employees at a reasonable wage. And so this bill is all about helping average Americans become better paid and better qualified. And so first off, right off the bat, it has $400 billion for universal pre-K and childcare subsidies. If I'm a mom or a dad, I'm stuck at home with a 2-year-old, I can't go out and work. But if I can get good childcare, or if I can get my child into pre-K, now they're in school 6 hours a day at an early age, well, then I can go back and start working again. And then there's $200 billion in this Build Back Better Act to continue the child tax credit, which works out to about $300 per month per child for 35 million families in this country. This is not an issue that affects the people watching this webinar, but many families live, hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck, and $300 a month is all it takes to lift most children out of poverty. $300 a month. Also, we know from the hurricanes we saw this year, the storms we saw this year, the forest fires we saw this year, the droughts we saw this year, that climate change is real. And $555 billion in this bill are going to address climate change and create clean energy options. And we know it's going to happen. There are people that still believe in coal. Not going to be a lot of coal being extracted 10 years from now. It's already the line between the cost of energy from wind and solar is heading this way, and the line from extracting coal is going this way. And with each passing year, the cheaper that green energy is, the more likely it's going to replace fossil energy. That's a good thing. And then another $130 billion to enable average Americans to keep buying their health insurance for the Affordable Care Act. And lastly, $150 billion for affordable housing. So these are all things that most Americans, 75% according to polls, would really like to have. And the problem is that there are 2 Democratic senators, Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, who object to this bill for a couple of reasons. And I think from Manchin's point of view, he's concerned about the cost. He's concerned that spending this extra 1.75 trillion on top of the 1.2 trillion is going to expand the deficit. And my answer is, well, in the last administration, the deficit grew by $7 trillion. Most of it because of the tax cuts of 2017. So thanks to those tax cuts, we expanded the deficit by $7 trillion. And all that money mostly went to wealthy corporations and wealthy individuals. And I'm not talking about 1%ers, I'm talking about 0.1%ers. So for average Americans got nothing out of that 7 trillion. And then we just ended the war in Afghanistan after 2 miserable decades. The total cost of that war was $2 trillion. We got nothing out of that, nothing at all. And of course, that added to the deficit as well. And so my response as a taxpayer and a voter and an American is I'd like to see some nation building done here. I'd like to have infrastructure in the United States that looks as good as places like China or South Korea or Singapore. So right now, it is uncertain whether this Build Back Better bill will go through. Congress is on recess this week, so nothing going on until next week. And then once you get past December and into January, well, now you're into full-on congressional elections for 2022. And it's very hard to get a significant bill through at that point. So it's kind of like we're up to a now or never moment on a bill that I think would significantly improve the lot for average Americans. Oh, and by the way, also pump a lot of money into the economy, which ultimately pumps up the stock market. So why can't DC politicians work for the average American instead of attacking each other? It's been a long stretch. I'm really not going to get into who's at fault at this point in time. I think everyone is aware of the situation, but if you have a political party that wants to spend money and accomplish things on the one hand, and the political party that wants to not spend money and probably break things or indeed break things, well, then we're stuck. So so that's where it is. Let's talk about the pandemic a little bit. Already almost 800,000 Americans have died. That's 2 out of every 1,000 Americans. There's some good news, at least here in New York City. It's pretty much pandemic is not something that people worry about. They take precautions. they wear their masks, they've had their vaccinations, but the case rate and the mortality rate is way down. In New York State, most of the mortality took place during the first 6 months of the pandemic when we were completely caught off guard. We had no way of knowing how to treat this disease, and we didn't have vaccinations. What's fascinating to me is that Texas and Florida now have more deaths in their population than in New York State. Well, on the one hand, New York State, Texas, and Florida all have about the same population, so it wouldn't be that surprising that the overall mortality would be about the same. But what is surprising is that in Texas and Florida, most of the mortality has been in the last 6 months. So after we knew about the disease and after we knew about vaccines. And that just is a mind-boggling statistic. It's almost like Governor Greg Abbott of Texas and Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida deliberately murdered their own voters just to make a political point. And I do not know what can be done to fix that. I've never, ever in my life seen anything as stupid as the argument over vaccinations or not vaccinations. People don't have a right to drive drunk. They shouldn't have a right to go around unvaccinated, but yet they do. It's a case of personal freedom. And then the number of parents going berserk over the vaccinations when their kids have already had 8 or 12 vaccinations in their lives. Again, I don't know what to say about that. So we'll let other people battle out the COVID thing. I would say that by the time the pandemic converts into kind of an ongoing thing, at the end of 2022, we'll have 1 million Americans dead, and shrug, that's how it goes. And then I'll be getting booster shots for the rest of our lives because the thing will be around and mutate, and it'll be like the flu. We'll get vaccinations for the COVID like we do for the flu. Okay, so where is the economy? Well, 18 months ago, March, April, May, things look pretty bleak. And I was reminded recently of how panicked we were about toilet paper and cleaning supplies, and should we be washing groceries with soap, and is it airborne, is it surface borne? We just didn't know. And for a brief 3 months, the stock market just plummeted, fell 35%. But then by the summer, investors realized that COVID kills people but leaves companies alone. And not every company survived. A number of companies went bankrupt. For the ones that did survive, they actually thrived. And it only took until this most recent quarter for the US economy to regain all of the economic GDP that it lost during the summer of 2020. And it only took 10 months for the unemployment rate to get down to 4.6%, kind of where it was before the whole pandemic started. What we're missing right now is 7 million people that were working previously. We've got a 4.6% unemployment rate, but 7 million people have stopped looking for work. Where did they go? Well, some died, a lot. They weren't all working people, but maybe half of them were working people. A lot of people have gone on permanent disability. They're not coming back to the workforce. A lot of people retired early. They may come back to the workforce later. And then lastly, there are still millions of parents that are stuck at home dealing with children or dealing with elderly parents, or they're afraid. They don't want to go back to work. So the job situation is kind of a puzzle right now. On the one hand, there is potential to regain another 5 million jobs, and we added 500,000 on Friday, so that's looking pretty good. But on the other hand, there's an enormous deficit of qualified talent. And I'm not talking about talent working for investment banks. I'm talking about talent to run restaurants and auto repair shops and work at Walmart this Christmas. And so the easiest way to address that issue for employers is to raise wages above minimum wage, which in most of the country is only $10 an hour. And you can't do much with $10 an hour, $15, $17, $18 an hour. Truck drivers, you can't get truck drivers right now. You can't get people to unload all of the boxcars that are piled up in the Port of Los Angeles. There's just not the people. The other thing you can do is spend some money on vocational training. That's part of the Buy Back Better group, so that the young people that are graduating from high school, not even college, just high school, actually had the talent to work at the Port of Los Angeles. Because in the old days, when you worked in a port, you carried sacks of grain on your back. These days, you operate a crane that picks up a 20-ton container and drops it onto a truck. That's a skilled job. That's not a very casual job. So the best way of resolving the problems that employers have and that people have is to get people childcare, get them healthcare, get them training, and boost their wages a little bit. Some people have said, well, David, if you do that, certain businesses will fail because they won't be able to afford their workforce. And my answer is, if your business only survives on minimum wage people, then you don't really have a business. And I don't think we need to obsess too much about whether those businesses survive or not. Okay, so the other topic that has everybody far more worried than COVID right now is inflation. Over the last 20 years, inflation averaged about 1.9% a year. And in the last 10 years, it averaged about 2.1% a year. And last year, or this year, it's jumped 5.9%. Last year, it was pretty much unchanged. This year, up 5.9%. And people are very frantic and upset. The prices have gone up. The price of gas has gone up. And yet there are shortages everywhere. Well, I've told my clients that you have to imagine that the US economy is like a FedEx 18-wheeler barreling down the highway at midnight, 85 miles an hour. And all of a sudden, a deer jumps out and the driver slams on the brakes and all of the packages go smashing through the back of the trailer, pile up in the front. And then the deer goes on and the driver nails the accelerator and all the packages go banging back the other way. Well, when the driver gets to his or her destination and opens the back of the truck, all the packages are in a just giant jumble. And that's the situation across the entire planet right now. If you want to buy a new car, you have to wait a long time. If you want to buy a new computer, you have to wait a long time because the chips that power the cars, the chips that power the computers are all in short supply. And the reason why they're in short supply is because the factories that produce the chips had to close down sporadically over the last 12 months when the factory workers got COVID. And then finally, the chips are produced, but then they get into a trailer and they get to a port in China or Singapore, and there's no boat to put the chips on. And then the boat finally starts to move, but then it gets to the Suez Canal, and that was blocked for 2 weeks by the container ship that got stuck. And so, there's products being shipped from overseas right now designed for the Christmas market that won't get here till March. Well, shrug, that's what happens sometimes. But again, you look back to these infrastructure bills, and a good chunk of it is being spent in ports to make them more automated and get some more capacity, get some more volume go through, operate 24 hours a day. So all these are all problems, but they're all solvable problems with time and money. Time and money. You can't get past physics. You can only build things so fast. But if you have time and money, you can do it. So where does that leave stocks? If you had been a betting person, for most people, a betting person last March would have said, yeah, stocks are going to plummet 50% and then plummet another 50% before this COVID thing is all over. But as we've reminded our viewers time and again, the stock market only cares about three things. It cares about earnings, it cares about revenues, it cares about earnings or profits, and it cares about interest rates. And plenty of companies did quite well. Amazon, for example, Apple, for example, during the pandemic, and those profits flowed into the stock market. But even companies like, we won't get too many companies at this point because I'm keeping an eye on the clock. Inflation is something to be concerned about now, but let's see what inflation is doing next year after all these bottlenecks are resolved, after all these supply shortages are resolved, after we get the chip factories back up to full capacity. What we're seeing is that, when you juice the economy with another, 1.2 trillion or 2 trillion or $2.5 trillion, that's a lot of new demand, and that's going to create a lot of revenues, a lot of earnings, and a lot of profits for the stock market, which as a result is at an all-time high. And then you might say, well, how much longer can it stay at an all-time high? It can go for a while because we're not talking about the expenditures of the next year, but we're talking about the expenditures of the next 10 years. So whereas after the 2008, 2009 recession, it took a full decade before we got back up to full capacity in the US economy, we could be at full capacity within a year or two. And that's good news for families, good news for companies, and good news for the stock market. All right, let me bring Buff back online and let us see what kind of questions came in. And Buff, put your mute button back on.
I'm here. By the way, quick editorial. I think that established media has done a pretty poor job until recently with regard to the supply chain story, because the supply chain story didn't start yesterday. It's been building for months and months and months, and surprise, surprise, because I don't think that the average person's awareness of it was, significant, if at all.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what's driving the angst, in the sense of, well, now that it's affecting me, it's been affecting all of us for quite some time.
Yeah.
It's a complex story,
Yeah.
but a story that needs to be told, and I think attributes, to your point, about a lot what's going on right now with inflation.
Yeah. Prior to the pandemic, the supply chain was structured for perfection.
Yes.
And now we know we need to build some resilience into the supply chain.
No question about it. I have a question for you regarding, the Fed and the market. Do you think that the Fed will continue to stimulate the bond market as it's been doing during the pandemic?
Yes. So the Fed has two purposes. One is to promote economic growth with moderate inflation, and the other is to promote full employment. And the employment situation looks good right now, so that would push the Fed to be less accommodative. And the inflation situation doesn't look so good, so that would actually push the Fed to raise interest rates faster rather than slower. That's the bad news. The good news is the Fed is aware of all the same factors that I'm aware of, and they're taking a wait and see approach. They've shifted to neutral on interest rate policy for the time being, and I don't think they're going to make any decisions about raising rates in a significant way until Q2 of next year. And then they'll see if inflation dies down, if job growth remains reasonable. Yeah, they might accommodate neutral for longer.
And a question that kind of related, in terms of the infrastructure piece, do you think there'll be various municipalities that float bond offerings to in other words, if they know they've got $1 billion coming from the feds, where they might float a bond to match that, to raise additional revenue for local projects?
Yeah.
And will that be an impact on the municipal bond market?
Yeah, if I was a state or municipality with the capacity to borrow, because you need to have the tax revenues to support borrowing, I'd borrow as much money as I could right now, because it's not going to be any cheaper for the rest of our lives. As an investor, the last thing I would buy right now is municipal bonds. The returns are so minuscule, even adjusted for taxes. And I think corporate bonds and junk bonds offer a lot more return for the same amount of risk.
Yeah. Also, do you see any significant changes coming with regard to the tax code?
Earlier this fall, I spent a lot of time wondering about the U.S. tax code. I wondered if the capital gains rate would go up. I wondered if the marginal income tax rate would go up for high earning Americans. I wondered if the estate exemption, which is currently 11.3 million per person, 22.6 million for a couple, would be cut back to the 2017 levels, which would take it back to about 6.6 per person, 13.2 for a couple. None of that seems to be likely to get into the Build Back Better bill. Mm-hmm. And the reason why is because tax policy is incredibly complicated. There are many vested interests. There are so many people opposing, so many lobbyists opposing changes to the tax code, and they're just running out of time. There was a proposal to tax billionaires only, on the annual appreciation in their investments. Because if you're somebody like Elon Musk, you don't pay taxes at all. How is that possible? Well, when you have $225 billion in Tesla stock, you don't need to sell it. You just you just borrow money against your Tesla stock, so you never need to pay taxes at all.
Okay.
And when I saw Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos spending $100 million each to fly in space for 8 minutes, 100 million is the cost of 2 high schools. I was like, we definitely need a billionaire's tax. Anyway, that's not even on the cards at all. So right now,
One more on taxes, quick. For our New Jersey and New York residents, do you think SALT cap gets raised, state and local?
In the most recent draft of the soft Build Back Better Act, they were going to increase the cap from 10,000 a year to some other number, 75,000, something like that. I just haven't agonized about it because until it goes through, and the other problem is that you have to make a bill like this revenue neutral. Well,
Right.
if you're cutting taxes here, that makes it that much harder to become revenue neutral.
Someplace else.
So maybe SALT, state and local taxes, people get a break, but I don't know. Very minimal changes to the tax code.
Yeah. Okay. Checking the queue, I don't see much. How about you, David?
Let's see here. We got one question about updating roads and bridges. Yep. This from somebody who came in late.
Okay.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of money spent on bridges and roads. 20% of the roads of the United States are in poor condition. And if you remember the history of that, there weren't any significant roads in the United States until after World War II. US 1 from Boston to Miami was like the most significant road that there was in the whole country. Dwight Eisenhower was very impressed by the state of the German autobahns, which allowed the Germans to move troops very rapidly back and forth. And so when he became president in 1948, he passed the interstate highway bill. And over the next 50 years, we spread interstates north and south and east and west and created an amazing grid. And interestingly enough, part of that plan included long stretches of straight, flat highways so you could land aircraft on those highways in a pinch. And those highways enabled an incredible post-war expansion of the US economy. But now it's been 50 years, and a lot of those highways are wearing out. And so it slows down commerce. It puts incredible wear and tear on trucks, and it's dangerous. And that's not the kind of infrastructure that you can really fix at the state or local level. There's not enough money. You need a global plan to fix it. So yeah, hopefully we'll have fewer bridges that fall down and better roads. And if that is all the questions we have, terrific. We are right up against 4:30, which was our goal. I just want to say that I am back in my New York City office for the first time in 19 months. It is delightful to be back with my team. And I have my fingers crossed that the Delta variant is not followed by a Gamma variant or a Omega variant or something else, and that we can truly get back to doing our jobs and taking care of our families. Everybody have a pleasant rest of your week.
Thank you, David.